Hello, my name's Lauren Schur, and I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, describing a new guide for researchers on enhancing the generalizability of impact studies. We'd like to thank the Institute of Education Sciences, IES, the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness, SEER, and the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, APAM, for co-sponsoring today's event, as well as another webinar that will occur on June 13th. That's going to discuss a guide for researchers who'd like to use a Bayesian framework for interpreting findings from impact evaluations. So stay tuned for that one. I'll soon turn it over to Matt Soldner, Commissioner of IES's National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance, who's going to get us started by discussing the genesis of this work. And then the guide's authors will dive into the key recommendations offered in the guide. Our two main presenters are Beth Tipton, Associate Professor of Statistics at Northwestern University, and Rob Olsen, Senior Fellow at the George Washington Institute of Public Policy at George Washington University. I would like to remind you to keep your microphones muted. And if you do have questions, if you could use the chat function to pose those questions, we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can following the presentation. And I also want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and will be available later this week. So with that, I'm just going to pass it on to Matt to get us started.
Hey, thanks, Lauren, and thanks everyone for joining us. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon, and to be in the company of two great scholars who have done really wonderful work in this area. I'm going to spend just a minute talking about the SEER principles, just in case you haven't been following along. You certainly be forgiven if you were not. Now, probably 3 years ago, Mark Schneider, our IS director, began publishing a series of blogs talking about ways he wanted to augment IES's What Works Clearinghouse standards, which I think you probably all know focus on the internal validity of impact studies. He wanted to augment those standards with a series of standards and recommendations that, if we could also begin to adopt as education scientists, could stand to make research more transformational, more actionable, more useful to the educators and policymakers who are the primary constituents for much of our work. And with that, the genesis of the SEER standards began. They were born kind of in the model of the LEAD standard, which many of us are familiar with. Ultimately, someday IES aspires to be able to badge studies showing their compliance with the SEER standards. But for now, we're really in a development phase along a series of 8 standards. And the 8 standards you can see on your screen, they're on the left side, run the gamut from pre-registration, when the study is just getting going, all the way to scaling, when we hope that the good work of discovery and impact evaluation are translated to the field. If you haven't been on our website, I'd encourage you to go to ies.ed.gov/SEER and read more. Today, though, we are focused on generalization. And if you were to go to that page and click on the generalization link, you would see a screen that looks a bit like this. Next slide. Awesome. All right. You see the beginnings of SEER standards related to facilitating the generalization of impact study findings, along with a series of resources. And you will see in that little tiny arrow on the kind of mid-left of your screen, we're here today to talk about our latest SEER standards resource, this NCE publication, Enhancing the Generalization or Generalizability of Impact Studies, by our two presenters today. So without further ado, on the next slide, I think I'm supposed to go dun da da da, or whatever those horns are meant to convey. Da 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 da. In February earlier this year, we released this truly wonderful guide, which our two co-presenters crafted for us, really for you, to begin to think about how it is you might design impact studies so that we really can fulfill the promise, right, of knowing what works, for whom, and under what conditions. With that, I know you did not join today to hear me extol its virtues. Instead, you came to learn. So I'm going to turn it over to Beth and Rob to take us through the presentation today. Thank you so much. And Beth, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm actually like mission control here today, so I'm going to make sure I can stay on top of this. Okay, I am going to start us off by just giving you a brief overview of what our plan is. And so the guide actually has 7 recommendations in it. The first 3 of these recommendations have to do with planning a study, will be our focus today. And so those include how to select a target population, how to develop a population frame, and how to design a sampling plan. And then we also include 4 recommendations for implementing these in a study. So this includes how to implement the sampling plan, how to assess the similarity between a sample and a target population, how to adjust for differences between a sample and target population, and how to report generalizability appropriately. So 5 and 6 we're not going to really spend much time on today, but we will be spending a little bit of time. We'll mention briefly number 4, and we will throughout the guide, our presentation today, talk a bit about reporting guidelines. But I just want to point you to the whole guide for this reason, that there are things in the guide that are not in our presentation today and that we expect you might be interested in. Okay, so again, Rob's going to begin by motivating the problem that this guide is designed to address. And then we're going to take turns giving an in-depth treatment of the guide's recommendations on planning, as well as an overview on of the guide's recommendations on implementing. And now from here, I'm going to pass this to Rob.
Thank you, Beth. And thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate your interest. So let's start. Why should impact studies aim for generalizability? Next slide, please. Or put differently, why should we care about generalizability when conducting impact studies? So as we know, the results from impact studies can inform decisions, such as whether to implement a program or policy, whether to adopt an intervention, or how to offer instruction. But as consumers of evidence of impact evaluations, decision makers should ask themselves at least 2 questions. The first, very familiar, is the impact reported by the study causal? To be interpreted causally, we know, given the association we're involved in, that the impact estimate should be based on a study design with strong internal validity. But the second question is the impact estimate relevant to my state or district or schools? If the impact estimate reflects cause and effect, but the study is conducted in schools that are very different from the schools for which the policymaker is responsible for, the evidence may not be relevant to the policymaker and the decisions that they have to make. This is the generalizability issue that we address in this guide. Next slide, please. Okay. So what do decision makers need to assess in trying to determine whether or not evidence is relevant to them? They need at least 2 things. The first is information on the types of district schools and students in the study sample to see how they compare to the district schools and students for which the decision maker is responsible. The second thing they need is information on baseline practices or the counterfactual for the study to see how it compares to baseline practices or the counterfactual in the decision makers' districts or schools. Unfortunately, this information is not always available in impact evaluation reports and publications, which sometimes makes it difficult for decision makers to assess whether the evidence is relevant to them. Next slide, please. So why is generalizability challenging? I mean, in a simple world, if the effect of the intervention that you're considering is constant, generalizability concerns disappear. If the intervention works in one context, it'll work everywhere. But we have reasons to believe that the impacts of educational interventions often vary. Weiss et al., in their 2017 paper, reports evidence on how much impacts vary across schools for a variety of educational interventions. Perhaps not surprisingly, they find that impacts vary a lot for some interventions and not so much for others. Now, when impacts do vary across schools, the variation is likely attributable to a variety of factors, including variation in student characteristics that are associated with the effectiveness of the intervention. The intervention may be effective, more effective for some subgroups of students than others. It may also be attributable to variation in business as usual or baseline educational practices, or the counterfactual to which the intervention is being compared, since the impact always depends on the counterfactual that's being compared. And third, the implementation of the intervention, how well it's implemented, how exactly is it implemented. Schools' abilities to implement interventions well may depend on factors we're all familiar with, including how well teachers are prepared to implement the intervention, school resources, and the amount of community support for the intervention. Next slide, please. So what can we do to produce more generalizable evidence when impacts may vary? The guide in this webinar cover a range of things that we as researchers can do. We can define the target population for our study more clearly. We can take steps to select and recruit a sample that represents the target population as much as is feasible and practical. We can assess the generalizability of the sample of those schools that agreed to participate. We can use statistical adjustments to improve generalizability, and we can report on the study's generalizability with transparency. These steps are possible, but until now, they have not been common practice as a collection in impact studies in education. Next slide, please. So the first recommendation in the guide is to select the target population for the study. Now, while research teams may be interested in more than one target population, we recommend choosing a primary target population to guide the study design and implementation. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by the study's target population? What we mean is that the collection of students and schools about which the impact study aims to learn. Now, impact evaluations usually aim to estimate an average impact of the intervention, but average over whom or over what? So a well-defined objective for an impact study is to estimate the intervention's average effect, average impact, for a well-defined target population, where the population is defined as some specific collection of students and schools. Now, I want to address what the term population may convey to the average listener. It may convey a broad collection of students and schools nationwide, but that's not necessarily the case. A population for a study doesn't need to be broad. It just needs to be well-defined, and it should be relevant to the decision or decisions faced by that policymaker. And I'll talk more about that shortly. So how should researchers go about selecting a target population? As a first step, we encourage researchers to identify variables known as impact moderators, factors that influence the direction and magnitude of the intervention's effects, and to use them to identify possible target populations for your study. The average impact of the intervention will vary across populations defined by the values of these variables. So, for example, if urbanicity and racial composition of enrolled students influence the intervention's impact in schools, then the average impact would be expected to be different in a population of urban majority Black schools versus a population of suburban majority white schools. So selecting impact moderators is a first key step in identifying possible target populations from which you could choose your primary one. So how can potential impact moderators be identified? I mean, anyone who's conducted an impact study knows we never begin impact studies knowing with confidence all of the factors that influence the impact of the intervention. So to identify potential impact moderators, we suggest that you first review the intervention's logic model. The logic model should indicate the mechanism through which the intervention is expected to influence outcomes. These mechanisms may shed light on the types of students or schools for which the intervention may be most effective. Second, when available, consider empirical evidence from the literature. if this is not the first evaluation of this intervention, you may be able to examine subgroup analyses from prior studies. For example, if a previous study found differences in impacts between African American and white students, this suggests that a student's race and the racial composition of students in the school may moderate the impact of the intervention. Alternatively, if this is the first evaluation of this particular intervention, but there have been evaluations of related interventions, you may find published subgroup evidence from evaluations of related interventions that can help you to select likely moderators for your intervention. And lastly, consult experts like the intervention developer. They may provide some insights about likely impact moderators. Now, we want to acknowledge that the information available to select moderators may be limited, but don't let that stop you from making your best guesses. Next slide, please. Okay. Next, define the target population based on substantive considerations. In particular, identify the target population for which it's determined the evidence would be most useful. The most useful target population is a judgment call that depends on the purpose of the study. If the purpose is to inform a specific policy decision by a particular policymaker or funder, the most useful target population would likely be all students or schools that would be directly impacted by that decision. For example, if a study is designed to inform decisions about whether to continue or cancel a federal or state education program, the most obvious target population would probably be all schools receiving funding from that program. On the other hand, some studies have a different purpose, a purpose to fill a gap in the evidence base in the literature. And in those instances, the target population could be defined to fill that gap. So, for example, suppose all prior studies of a particular intervention had been conducted in urban schools, and the impacts in rural schools were thus unknown and of potential policy interest. In that case, the study could restrict its target population to only rural schools. Identifying the target population based on substantive considerations is a key step in defining what the study aims to learn, and it should be motivated by a well-defined policy or research objective. Next slide, please. Finally, we recommend narrowing the population if necessary based on pragmatic considerations. And pragmatic considerations loom large in conducting large-scale impact studies. It could be that from a substantive perspective, the research team is interested in a broad national population, but in practice, including a national sample isn't feasible. For example, a study team may need to exclude schools from districts or states that are located far from where the study team is located. Study schools located far from the study team creates logistical challenges and has cost implications if researchers need to be on site to recruit the sample, collect data, or implement the intervention. So it may be necessary to exclude schools that are far away. In addition, the study team may need to exclude schools for which necessary data are not available. For example, if you plan to rely on state longitudinal data systems or data from district administrative files for key variables, then you'll need to exclude states and districts that can't provide the data you need. And critically important, we recommend considering these issues upfront and defining the target population to include schools that you can realistically include in the study sample and exclude schools that you can't. Finally, we want to acknowledge that there are real trade-offs in deciding how broadly to define the target population. Defining the target population broadly can elevate the study's aspirations and perhaps its applicability to a wide range of decision makers. But if the study can't reasonably recruit a sample that represents that broad population well, those aspirations may be unachievable. Researchers face a trade-off between a broader and potentially more important population, in some cases, that they can't reasonably represent, and a narrower population that they can. But this is less policy interest, less broad policy interest anyway. So the key is trying to strike the right balance given the objectives of the study. Okay, back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, Rob just set it up, and now we're gonna talk about how to operationalize this in practice. Okay, so Rob talked about the target population, and one of the things that we do in this guide is we separate that from the idea of the concept of a target population from how we operationalize that in a population frame. So a population frame is actually a list of all of the schools that would meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria in the population we're interested in. So ideally, this list will include schools that are part of the target population, so those that are eligible, and it will exclude those that are ineligible. In order to be useful for developing a sampling plan, we need this population frame to have certain information in it. First, it needs to have identifying information. So it's not helpful just to have numbers, but we all, 1 through 2000, we actually need to also know the names of the schools, for example, that are involved in the population, their location, if they're, their address, their state. Ideally, we would also know their NCES ID because we can then match that to other information. You would want contact information so that if you use this list to develop a sampling plan, you could actually then have information on how to reach people that you needed to reach. We'd also like it to include potential impact moderators. So Bob just talked about how to think about those, but we want to think about which ones are available in population data and how we could assemble data sets to get to this. And then other variables that you might help you distinguish eligible schools from ineligible schools. So again, it just needs to include all the schools that are in the population to the extent possible and exclude schools that aren't in the population to the extent possible. And I keep saying to the extent possible because sometimes we don't know if a school is eligible or ineligible until we actually contact them and talk to them about the study. It doesn't really have to be perfect, and that's sort of something we want to emphasize throughout this guide, that we need some way of identifying eligible schools, but we can also screen out ineligible schools during the recruitment process. Just to give you a sense, for example, it may be that you only want to include schools that have certain business as usual practices, and we don't have those in a data set anywhere. And so you might want to instead contact schools and find out what their current business as usual practice is while keeping track of the process we're using throughout. In the guide, we point to several sort of data sources that could be useful for developing population frames. I'm just going to briefly discuss these. So the Common Core of Data, it actually is a list of all of the public schools in the United States. Each state reports annually this information to the federal government. It's usually, there's a lag by a couple of years before the data is available to us, but you can download that data, and it includes district names and schools, student enrollment information, etc. FX has some more information as well at the state and school district and school level. The American Community Survey actually has something called the School District Demographic System, which aggregates American Community Survey data to the school district level, which can be helpful if you've got some richer measures of, for example, language, home language, and socioeconomic measures. If you're interested in private schools, there's a Private School Universe survey that also is updated. And then if you're interested in sort of measures of achievement, which are not available in any of these other data sets, the Stanford Education Data Archive, SEDA, provides in many cases, school level information about achievement and achievement gaps. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of give you an example to see, so you can see how this would work in practice. We're following this example, by the way, throughout. So we have we're imagining an intervention in which a team of cognitive psychologists they're developing a new reading program for early elementary school, K through 2. And the curriculum, the idea of it focuses on reading materials that include Black and Hispanic families throughout the materials. And so their hypothesis is that by including better representation of Black and Hispanic families in the reading materials, it will improve student engagement and learning for these students. So as an example, the research team expects the impacts to be moderated by a range of variables. So for example, since it's focused on Black and Hispanic students, they would expect race and ethnicity to moderate the treatment effect. As well as the school's existing reading programs, since these programs may vary in how well they currently represent Black and Hispanic families in the materials. To think through what the target population is, in the example, they realize that first it has to offer grades K through 2 because that's the program, that's the sort of the target of the reading program. They've decided to limit the population to schools that have at least 50% Black and Hispanic students, because again, this is the focus of the program. Ideally, they would like to focus also on those in Title I schools, given policymakers' interest in disadvantaged schools. And this last criterion is focused on constraints, just real constraints in their research, which is that the researchers are located in the Southeast. They're located in this region, and so they think that they will have the best success and ability to recruit in this area. Based upon this, they develop a population frame. And so the most recent data when we were putting this example together is the 2018 to 19 Common Core of data. And so looking through this, they could put together a list of school level variables that they might include as potential moderators. So the grades offered, racial and ethnic percentages, Title I status, the region, percent free and reduced lunch, urbanicity, and the school size, as well as some district level aggregates. So information on English language learners, as well as how big the district is. Okay, from there, so going back to the sort of general plan, the next step after you have this data is to develop a sampling plan. Just to give you an overview, something we've kept in mind, throughout this entire guide is the idea of, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so I'm going to begin by saying that obtaining a perfectly representative sample for impact studies in which we have voluntary participation is completely infeasible. And we know that going in, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to try our best. So what we're trying to do is to obtain a sample that's as representative as possible. And the strategy we're going to use is fairly simple. So we're going to divide schools into strata based upon these potential moderators. We're going to set recruitment targets within each of these strata. And we're going to set them proportional to how many schools are in the population in each stratum. And then we're going to select schools and replacement schools for recruitment to obtain a sample that is as representative as possible of the target population. Okay, so stratification is really easy if we have just a couple of variables and if those variables are easily made into sort of categorical variables. So here we have an example. Imagine a case in which we wanted to say school level. So here we have elementary, middle, and high schools in the columns, and then we set urbanicity and we classify urbanicity into urban versus others. That's 2. So now we have 6 strata. And you would imagine then recruiting within each of these strata. Continuous variables, we could also do this. If we only had 2 variables, I could easily divide those a continuous variable into some sort of categories. So I could divide, something above the median and below the median. I could use the quartiles, etc., in order to create sort of simple strata like this. The problem that we have is that we very often would expect there might be more than 2 moderating variables. And the reason for this is that we don't know in advance, right, what the moderators are. And so we want to be careful and sort of err on the side of including more possible moderators in our sampling plan than limiting ourselves to just 1 or 2. So when we have more than 2, you can imagine that this gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So for example, if we had 5 just binary variables that are each in 2, that creates 32 strata. And often randomized trials include maybe 30 or 40 schools, so that's not enough. So to address this challenge, we need a sort of a dimension reduction strategy, a way to take a lot of variables and make them into a small number of strata. And for this, we're going to use cluster analysis methods. The idea of cluster analysis is it's a sort of a set of methods that have been around for quite a while that allow you to group together similar observations. And so on the right, you can see this is this sort of a visualization of what this might look like. The Generalizer, which is a free online tool, uses k-means cluster analysis to group similar schools based on these moderators. And you can use these cluster analysis methods to create strata. So here we're using what comes out of cluster analysis are typically called clusters to create what we're calling here strata. We're being really careful with our language because sometimes in randomized trials we use the word clustered, as in cluster randomized trial, to mean schools or sites. And so I just want to be sort of to highlight that as a language being careful with. Oops. The question is, how many of these strata do you need? So I'm saying we're going to use cluster analysis. We're going to sort of input in a variety of variables. We're going to export out some sort of clusters. How many should we have? Something we know is that the more strata that we have, the better off we have in terms of getting the sample to be as similar to the population. But if we have too many strata, then you have all of these additional constraints for recruitment, which makes it really, really hard. And so you've got this sort of push and pull between the, what's ideal in terms of getting something for generalizability versus what is feasible. So the guide, based upon previous studies and the general literature, even in cluster analysis, recommends that you might consider 4 or 5 or 6 clusters as probably in the right ballpark of what's reasonable and useful. You can actually calculate the percent variance explained for each of these. So what that means is how much, if I said there are 10 variables and I've divided things into clusters based upon those variables, how much of the variation total in these covariates is between clusters versus within clusters. More between means that I've created more homogeneous clusters where ideally all of the variation is between clusters, but in many cases it's sort of in between. So you might choose 5 clusters if the percent variation is explained as higher for 4, but only slightly lower for 6. Within strata, you're then going, the guide provides sort of a couple of strategies for how you could select schools. And so there's a couple of different strategies that we provide in the guide. One is to use probability sampling. In this case, you would have a list of all of the population schools in each stratum, and you would set a selection probability here. Importantly, I just want to note, we mentioned it in the guide that these could be equal probability, they could be unequal probability, but the key here would be that it'd be random selection. Another strategy we talk about in the guide is called balance sampling, and the idea of balance sampling is that you give priority instead to schools that are the most similar to the average. So if you were to go to stratum 1, you would give more, would sort of rank things from those that are most average to least average, if that makes sense, within each stratum, and you would give priority to those. A good question many people have is, how can probability sampling be used in these impact studies? So some might say, oh, that's impossible, but we want to highlight that there are cases in which we have used probability sampling. It's often used in surveys. Survey researchers that are, really the field in which probability sampling is used. It's occasionally used in impact studies like the Head Start impact study. The guide provides one approach to random sampling. So here you would just randomly sort the schools, and then you would start from the top and recruit down. And we talk about sort of placing guidelines for the first sample and then including replacements. For balance sampling, it's a general set of strategies in which you just are trying to get a sample that is more similar to the population on sort of observed characteristics. And to do that, we talk about a strategy in which you sort from the most similar to the least using based upon the covariate means. And then you start from the top of the list and you work your way down again for recruitment. And the guide covers sort of trade-offs and limitations of both. Okay, so just to make this make more sense, I think I'm going to talk about this in terms of an example. So I'm going to return back to the example that I just provided. And here I'm going to talk about using the Generalizer, which is a free web tool. At the very end of this presentation, we'll give you the website for it. But though in the free web tool, it has the Common Core of data built in, as well as some data from the American Community Survey. And for those of you, by the way, who are in looking at secondary education, it has IPEDS data built in. And so here we use the tool to divide the population into 5 strata using k-means cluster analysis based upon a set of moderators that I described earlier. And within each, we calculate the means and standard deviations for each moderator, and then we use this to set the target number of schools for each stratum. Okay, so this is just what the landing page of the Generalizer looks like. And here are characteristics. So here's the idea. We first went through and had these variables, which are listed by rows. This data is available in the Common Core of data. And then it divided schools into 5 strata so that the schools within strata are more similar to than schools between strata. If we sort of look through this, you'll see, for example, that stratum 1 has smaller schools. So in stratum 1, the average school was urban and about half of the students are Black. In stratum 2, the average school is located in a small school district with relatively few schools and is about 60% Black or Hispanic. In stratum 3, the average school is located in a large suburban district and is about 75% Black or Hispanic. In stratum 4, the average school was also located in a large suburban district, but it's almost entirely Black or Hispanic. And these schools are located in districts where for more students, English is not the home language. And in the 5th stratum, the average school was smaller than in the other strata. It was also about 75% Black, and almost all students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So this is just us qualitatively looking through here and thinking, okay, what kinds of schools end up in each of these strata? This can actually be helpful to describe the population when you're reporting on your study as well. Okay, so then this table also is based upon a table that the Generalizer outputs. And what you'll see in the first row here is the number of schools in the population frame in each of these strata. So for example, you can see that stratum 1 is quite a bit smaller. It only has 285 schools in it, whereas stratum 5 is quite a bit larger and has 1,400 schools in it. It also then provides you with a row that gives you the percentage of the schools in the population. So this is easier scale. So again, you can see that this ranges from 5% to 34%. And then at the last, it takes a sample size. So if we were doing a cluster randomized trial, for example, and we had 40 schools in it, and we made this proportional, if I said 40 times each of these percentages, how many schools would I need to recruit? So I will need to recruit 2 schools in stratum 4, whereas I would need to recruit 13 schools in stratum 5. Okay. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Beth. Okay. Beth has just finished describing our recommendations on designing studies for greater generalizability, which is the primary focus of this webinar. In the remainder of the webinar, we're going to summarize our recommendations for implementing studies for greater generalizability. Our presentation of these recommendations is deliberately light on details, so we encourage you to review the guide for more information. Next slide, please. Thanks. So implementing the sampling plan involves recruiting schools in accordance with that plan. But before recruiting schools, it's helpful for the study team to consider the challenges they may face in successfully recruiting schools that represents the target population. These challenges include higher refusal rates in some strata than in others, a very common phenomenon. And also, even within strata, it's possible that refusals are related to both observed moderators, those that are included in the population frame and were even used to contribute to stratification, but also to unobserved moderators that were not included in the population frame, either because the data were not available to include in the frame, or because the researchers just didn't even think about that variable as being a likely moderator. What we would encourage is that the study team should try to anticipate these kinds of challenges and design the recruitment effort to mitigate those risks. Next slide, please. So the guide covers several strategies for mitigating these challenges, including training recruiters to intensively recruit schools higher on the list before recruiting schools lower on the list. As Beth noted, both of the methods for selecting sites that are highlighted in the guide both involve rank ordering schools within strata. So it's important that recruiters know that they need to start at the top of the list before they start working their way down. In addition, another strategy for mitigating the risks of obtaining an unrepresentative sample during the recruiting process is to establish financial incentives and reallocation of recruitment effort towards schools in hard to recruit strata. While conducting a study, you may find that one of the strata for which you're trying to hit your recruitment targets is just really challenging. The schools there are not responding to your outreach, or they are responding and they have reasons for not wanting to participate. In those cases, additional effort and resources can be redirected to help boost recruitment in those strata. Third strategy that the guide highlights is tracking school participation decisions and reasons for declining to participate. Tracking school participation decisions is necessary just from an operational perspective, but tracking the reasons for declining can be very helpful when trying to get a better understanding of how the schools that agree to participate might be different from the schools that aren't. And then lastly, the guide provides some recommendations on how to collect and report information on both recruited schools that agree to participate and on recruited schools that decline to participate, since those differences can be illuminating for understanding issues of generalizability. Okay. So the guide also covers lots of details on 4 steps that research teams can take. I'll highlight them and refer you to the guide. The first is to budget time and resources for recruitment. The second is to build and manage a recruitment team. These 2 steps are standard practice for large research organizations that conduct large-scale impact studies on a regular basis. The third step is to screen out schools that are ineligible for the study. As Beth noted, there may be times where it's not possible or practical to screen out all ineligible schools. So it's important as part of the recruitment process to try to identify them when you reach out to them so that you can exclude them from the study. And fourth, to collect and report data on volunteers, schools that agreed to participate, and decliners, schools that didn't agree to participate. And the example that I provide next will illustrate steps 3 and 4. Okay, so we are going to build on the earlier example. And the table shown here includes a tracking spreadsheet for this hypothetical study that Beth introduced. And in this hypothetical study, used this tracking spreadsheet to track the recruitment process for schools selected for the study. So in this particular example, Memphis Rise Academy wasn't interested in testing the intervention. This is pretty common when recruiting for impact studies. It could be that either the school is just not in the market for a new, in this case, a new reading intervention, because that's what the study was designed to test. Maybe they had adopted a new reading intervention recently, or maybe there's just something about the reading intervention that's being offered that isn't attractive to some of the schools that you may be trying to recruit. So this happens. Arnold Memorial Elementary School never responded to outreach by the study team. I would have to guess this is probably the modal response for schools that are recruited, is getting no response at all. Now, both Bon Lin Elementary School and Madison Creek Elementary School responded to the outreach, were confirmed eligible, and agreed to participate. So that's a win. Lastly, Cumberland Gap Elementary School was found to be ineligible because, contrary to what the data in the population frame suggested, it didn't fall within the target population parameters. So this example just shows you a range of possibilities that you're going to face in recruiting schools and provides a bit of a template for trying to track all that information and document it so you can report selected pieces of that information as part of your study. Next slide, please. Now, continuing the hypothetical example, the table shown here uses data from the population frame to compare the 40 schools that agreed to participate in this hypothetical study to the 70 schools that were recruited, confirmed eligible, but did not agree to participate. These two groups were different in some notable ways. For example, the 40 schools that agreed to participate, the volunteers, had lower percentages of students who were eligible for free and reduced price lunch, but were more likely to be located in rural areas than the 70 schools that declined to participate, the decliners. So we recommend making these types of comparisons to identify risks to the generalizability of the study findings. Next slide, please. So the fifth recommendation after recruitment is completed is to assess the similarity between the sample and the target population. Once schools are recruited, the study team should compare recruited schools to all schools in the target population using data from the population frame to assess how well a study sample represents the population. In particular, studies can do two things. First, they can calculate the standardized mean difference between the sample mean and the population mean for each potential moderator in the population frame, variable by variable. And second, researchers can construct a generalizability index that summarizes the differences between the sample and the population across all potential moderators in the frame. Note that the generalizability index is based on propensity score methods, and we encourage you to check out the guide for more details on how it's constructed. But before we move on, I want to point out that the generalizability index is useful in determining whether any statistical adjustment is needed to the sample to support claims of generalizability to the target population. So let's consider different possible values of the index. If the index value is high, greater than 0.9, research has shown that no adjustments are needed. This is a case where the sample is as similar to the target population on observed characteristics as would be anticipated from a random sample. In contrast, if the index is high or medium, some sorts of adjustment is needed and should be sufficient to support generalizations as long as the index is based on a comprehensive set of impact moderators. The difference between high and medium is if the index is high, then the variance penalty or loss in statistical precision is going to be small. But if the index is medium, then the statistical adjustments needed to support generalizability will come with a large variance penalty, and substantial precision will be lost in the impact estimates. Now, lastly, if the index is low, less than 0.5, then statistical adjustments won't be sufficient, and the study team may want to consider narrowing their inferences to a portion of the original target population that the sample can be shown to represent. I mean, those are tough choices to make, and they just highlight the importance of having a strong sampling design and an effective recruiting effort to obtain a sample that's as representative of the target population as possible, so these types of adjustments become less necessary. Next slide. Okay. So the sixth recommendation in the guide is to adjust for differences between the sample and the target population. And I'm going to give a very brief overview of these methods. The first involves weighting adjustments. Weights can be constructed and used to adjust for differences between the sample and the target population, between participating schools and all schools in the population. So these weights will be set greater than 1 for the types of schools that are underrepresented in the sample to weight them up, and they'll be set less than 1 for the types of schools that are overrepresented in the sample to weight them down. The guide describes how to construct weights using 2 methods. The first is post-stratification, which typically relies on the original sampling strata to create weighting adjustments, or propensity score methods. And these methods are both used historically to address non-response in surveys, which is a natural parallel to the problem faced here. Next slide. Yeah. So alternatively, regression models can be used to adjust for differences between the sample and the target population. The general idea is to first model the relationship between impacts and potential moderators in the study sample. And then second, to plug the average characteristics of the target population into the model to predict the population average impact. The guide provides more details on how to implement weighting and regression methods for enhanced generalizability. Okay, the 7th and final recommendation of the guide is to report generalizability appropriately. The guide covers 2 steps that researchers can take to make the generalizability of their impact studies and the impact study findings more transparent. The first really sets up the second. The first is that throughout the study, it's important to collect information necessary for reporting generalizability. The guide provides detailed suggestions on what information should be assembled. And the second is to integrate generalizability into all facets of reports and papers on study findings from impact studies. The guide lists information that should be reported, suggests sections of the paper or report where it could be presented, and provides sample text to help clarify how researchers can make the generalizability of their study findings more transparent. Okay, back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Rob. So just to wrap it up, we just want to highlight where you can learn more about this. First of all, you should go download the guide. And so the website is here. You can also check out the Generalizer, which is at www.thegeneralizer.org. Again, it's a free web tool, and it includes both software for planning studies as well as software for assessing generalizability. And in the next few months, we will also be adding in software that does power analysis. And the last is a package called Generalize R package, which is not quite on CRAN yet for those of you using R, but it implements all of the same methods, but allows you flexibility to use whatever data you have. Lauren, were you going to say this, or am I?
You can go ahead. I can
Okay,
if you have.
Yeah, okay, so thank you. So also as part of this contract, IES is sponsoring consultation sessions for researchers to get individualized help with generalizability. So we of course hope that you will have read the guide, but you maybe will come to us with some challenges or nuances to your particular study. After, what you can expect is after this webinar, you will get an email from where you registered, perhaps from Mathematica, that will give you a link to how you could sign up for a consultation. Until then, if you have any questions about this opportunity, you can email Nima, and you can see this email address here. And so from here, I'm just going to leave this open for questions or comments. And I was going to say, for more information, you can contact us here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave up this slide, I think, for now. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Beth and Rob. So we don't have that many questions in right now, but we do have a few. One of the questions is whether or not the slides are available. And I put what I answered there is that the recording itself will be available towards the end of the week. I put in the link to the guide and it looks like it's there again. That's putting it in again. And pretty much all of the material that's in the slides is in the guide. So you can find all of this and more in the guide itself. And so, and we, as Beth mentioned, we will be following up with an email if you're interested in individualized consultations. Beth, there was a question that came in that you responded to, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to elaborate on that. Billy Buchanan asked, why wouldn't covariate balanced random sampling, for example, randomly selecting based on only randomizations that ensure covariate balance be recommended? Did you want to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I said yes, you could use that. Certainly, you can use a variety of more advanced methods. We just focused on sort of introducing people to the general frameworks of probability sampling and balance sampling. Could I address this question by Karen too,
Yeah,
Lauren?
go ahead. Do you want to just read it first?
Yeah, so Karen says, oftentimes recruiting is initiated at the district level rather than the school level, and what are the implications? So this is not really exactly in the guide, but you are correct. A lot of times people focus on district level recruitment, and I have some work that shows that as a result, we tend to favor very large districts in our research, even though 70% of school districts in the country only have a single school in them. And so I think the way that I would approach this is to sort of do both, right? So that, and this is my understanding for people who work on the ground, that often you're approaching the district, but you're also recruiting the schools within the district at the same time. And so what this suggests is that going to only a single district may not be great for having broad generalizability. You may actually want to target 2 or 3 districts at least, and then recruit schools within them. And also noting that some school districts are more heterogeneous than others. So there are some school districts that include a wider range of school sizes and school backgrounds and demographics, et cetera, than others. So I think you might consider a sort of a 2-pronged strategy here.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that, which is that the guide does cover briefly how one can go about selecting a 2-stage sample of districts and then schools within districts, where one could, for example, select districts with probabilities proportional to size and then select a fixed number of schools per district. So see the guide for more on that if you're interested.
Are there other questions?
I know for a fact I'm not that clear, so there must be other questions.
Thank you, Billy, for adding in your experience.
Definitely.
Slide on free data resources for. Yes, Amy, there's a table in the guide that lists these data sources. I'm not sure what the table number is. There is a table in the guide because we just copied it over from the guide into the slides.
Yes, and all of them are free, to the best of my understanding. So.
Yeah, they're all free. To level policies. Billy, you've got lots of great hard questions.
You want to read the question? Because
yeah, so Billy's question is, how do you recommend handling differences in school or district level policies that may be important to consider? For example, a school assignment, class size, etc. So I think I'll take a stab and then Rob, you can jump in too. But I think the first question is, which parts of these policies have to do with eligibility in the study? And which parts of these policies may have to do with, affecting the treatment effect in some way. And those are the two, I would sort of separate out those 2 categories. If they affect eligibility, it may be that you are able to know that in advance, and it may not be. It may be that you only know that once you contact them, and the guide provides sort of a strategy for how to keep track of this information about eligibility so that you can sort of glean information from it. The part about moderators, again, it may be that this is available to you in data. It may not be. And again, you might collect some of this information. A lot of what we're pointing out here is to be very transparent in how you recruit, to be very transparent in the goals of your recruitment, and to collect data that we can learn from about recruitment and about generalizability. So certainly there are these policies that make things tricky, but I wouldn't get so wrapped up in like tiny little details, I guess.
Agreed.
Thank you, Hanley. That just to for Amy, that table 1 on page 13 is where you would find that information on the common data sources available.
Okay, so Mary asks, in your example, you focused on some pretty standard variables. Is there a danger that this approach could lead to the same schools rising to the top for many studies, and as a result, getting a lot of requests for participation in studies? If all of the studies funded by IES through contracts and grants were studying the exact same interventions, I would be worried about that more than I am, given the wide range of things that we're interested in. You know, the current practice, if you were to look at schools, are that we really go to very large school districts a lot. So we already have a system in place in which people are going back to the same districts over and over and over again for schools. I actually think that by going through this exercise, what you'll discover is that there are school districts and schools that you just didn't even think about that are that this will expand your choice set and is more likely to occur than what is occurring sort of right now in practice.
Completely agree.
Any other questions? Okay. For the presenters, do you feel like there's anything else that you would like to share, or Matt?
No, I think I look forward to you guys reading the guide, and I hope to hear from you. I hope feel free to write us with questions, and I hope some of you will sign up for the office hours if needed.
That would be fantastic. It would be great to talk with some of you.
Okay, so I just want to thank the presenters. This was really great. I hope folks learned a lot. I hope folks go and read the guide and take part in the consultations. I also want to thank the folks at SEER, Ellen Weiss and Jen Cush, who helped organize this, as well as Hanley Chang and Nima Rahimi at Mathematica, who helped, and Amy Johnson and Tom Way, who provided great feedback along the way. So thanks to everyone. We just want to give you that plug that I mentioned earlier, that we're going to have another webinar on June 13th, talking about Bayesian interpretation of effects, and we hope that many of you sign up for that one. So thank you all, and have a nice day.
Thank you.